All right, guys. So I wanted to go over that DBQ practice number two, the Republican women cult of domesticity, a little bit, just to give you some pointers and tips and some information on what I saw collectively as we went through that essay. First off, everything you do has to start with the prompt. So make sure you're reading the prompt and know what you're being asked to do before you do anything else. It's definitely worth it to take the 5 minutes or so at the beginning of your writing time to evaluate the prompt and maybe even write a little pre-write chart. So when you look at this prompt, evaluate the extent to which the emergence of a Republican motherhood and the cult of domesticity influenced the lives of American women in the period from the American Revolution to the outbreak of the Civil War. So you are being asked to evaluate the extent to which these two things influenced American women during this time period. So, in other words, if we were to look at that, this is what you could say, or you could rephrase the prompt this way. How much did Republican motherhood and the cult of domesticity influence American women's lives from the 1770s to the Civil War? So you've got to do some contextualization first. What's going on that brought us to this point? So I saw a lot of contextualization that wasn't really relevant to the prompt. So you need to make sure that you're still addressing the prompt even with your contextualization. So some ideas. You could be talking about the Enlightenment and how there are new ideas about human rights. Definitely should be talking about the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. Specifically, you can even mention that in the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men were created equal, leaves out 50% of the population. You also have a growing industrial revolution, which is starting to demonstrate itself in growing class divides. You also see that class divide in particular with regards to slavery, and that this issue with regards to slavery is going to come to a head with the Civil War, and then ultimately the 15th Amendment will be passed, and former slaves will get the right to vote before women, further causing more divides in our country. You also have growing antebellum reform movements led by women, primarily the temperance, suffrage, abolition, and prison reform movements. You could also possibly mention the Second Great Awakening as well. You also need to be defining these terms. Don't assume that people know what they mean. They're testing you to see what you know what they mean. So Republican motherhood is this notion that women are seen as the primary educators of children and need to be minimally educated themselves to maintain civic virtues and values. This means that we would raise boys to be active participants in the republic, since they are the ones that can vote. The cult of domesticity arises out of this as well. It's a prevailing value system of primarily middle and upper class women in the 19th century that valued femininity, women's work or role within the home, and they were viewed as the center of home life, and that women should embody piety, purity, domesticity, and submissiveness. So these two things go hand in hand, although they're slightly different. All right, so then you get into analyzing your documents. This is the first document. This was the letter many of you mentioned as being written by a Philadelphia woman. Most importantly, she's writing it in 1776, the first year of the American Revolution. We don't have a specific date, so she may have even been doing this before the actual Declaration of Independence. But what you can assume is that she is giving up part of her life as a choice. And you can see that in what she says. I have retrenched every superfluous expense at my table and family. Tea I have not drunk since last Christmas, nor bought a new cap or gown. Why is she giving those things up? It's because she's trying to boycott British made goods and worked to learn to knit and making stockings of wool. It's not am no, it's am now. She wasn't the world's best speller for making for her servants. This way I throw my might to the public good. That's where she's saying, I am helping the public and our democracy by doing these things. So this is the embodiment of Republican motherhood. This is likely one of the women who was called a daughter of liberty, and women were encouraged to do these things as their role in the American Revolution. She is not saying that she feels like a slave. She's saying that if she is not free, she will be a slave. And this is her part to make sure that are going to have freedom. So many of you misinterpreted this document. Document number 2, the equal share that every citizen has in liberty. This is Dr. Benjamin Rush. Thoughts upon female education. Again, the date is important, 1787. So this is during the Articles of Confederation. Benjamin Rush was an Enlightenment thinker. He actually was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a doctor who actually sent his well-known famous Rush's pills with Lewis and Clark out west. Basically, they were a purgative that made you barf and poop, and a scholar who started colleges. He said that every citizen has a role in liberty, not necessarily that our women should be qualified with a certain degree, but they should have a suitable education that was enable them to instruct sons on the principles of liberty and government. Again, this is really demonstrating and embodying that Republican motherhood ideal. Document 3, showing you occupations of women in Massachusetts in 1837. Again, the dates are important. Who's going to work? Women of lower classes didn't have the luxury of the cult of domesticity. There's a growing class divide. The context for this is the low mill girls, as well as the Industrial Revolution. Women's work outside the home also happened to be limited to low-skill, low-education positions. So there really weren't opportunities for women except in these positions here. And you can see that that coincides with this letter. You see that sort of disdain that some of the middle and upper class women might have had for factory workers in the woman's second line. But I suppose your mother would think it far beneath your dignity to be a factory girl. And initially, she doesn't like working in a factory, and many of you sort of read to there and stopped. But then she says, but the longer I stay, the better I like. And I think nothing unforeseen calls me away. I shall stay here till fall. She's getting a taste of independence, both socially and economically. And she, in fact, is encouraging her, I think it's her niece, to come and join her, assuming her mother would let her do so. So again, you're starting to see these class divides. This is in 1839, just shortly after that chart above. So again, you have to put all these documents in concert with each other, and they need to be talking to each other and about each other, and they're not happening in isolation. Document number 5, this is the Women's Movement, Putnam's Monthly Magazine. This is a response, a direct response to women demanding more rights and freedoms. If you go all the way back to 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention, which is where Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony issued the Declaration of Sentiments, which modeled itself after the Declaration of Independence and basically was demanding equal rights for women, including the right to vote. But here you see you have people pushing back against that. Women is, shh, you guys, zip it. By nature, inferior to man, and women are to be a fountain of unmixed blessing, she is to the men. So she's just there to sparkle and make a man's life better. So what is going on in society at the time that causes this to be published? You need to consider the context of these things. Many of you didn't have adequate outside historical evidence. You'll see me mark those as HOEs just to be fast. Things that should have been or could have been mentioned: Daughters of Liberty, Abigail Adams talking to John Adams about not forgetting women when they create a republic. Most women were prohibited from attending college. And in fact, the first colleges that began accepting women didn't start until 1833. However, you do have an expansion of men's right to vote and property requirements, which in turn causes women to say, hey, what about us? You also have these reform movements that are being led by women, and a second great awakening where you could have salvation regardless of your gender. The abolition movement is being pushed in a large part by women. You have the Seneca Falls Convention, which I've already mentioned, the Industrial Revolution, as well as growing immigration. Women coming to work in factories were usually poor immigrant women, and they couldn't afford not to work. They didn't have the luxury of staying home and taking care of educating the children. And in fact, most often, those kids were also working in factories as well. You have westward expansion happening. Women are getting a greater role as they move west out of necessity. They often owned businesses and co-farmed with their husbands as they moved west. Women had the right to vote in Western states far earlier than Eastern states. And you have some pushback from people from a traditional value standpoint, often very much tied to evangelical biblical traditions as well. So, those are all the things that could have and should have and would have been in your essays. Make sure you're reading those documents very thoroughly. All right. Good luck on the next one.